What can a statue say if it has no voice? We pass them in museums, smooth, silent still. Carved from marble or cast in bronze, they stand in rows or alcoves, heads tilted, robes folded, expressions frozen somewhere between presence and absence. We often admire their detail. We notice the flowing drapery, the strong profiles, the missing noses. But do we ever ask, what are they trying to tell us? In ancient Rome, these statues were more than decoration. They were statements of identity, of power, of memory. They lived not in quiet corners, but in gardens, on altars, in public squares, in courtyards, along busy roads. They watched, waited, and bore meaning. The Romans believed sculpture could say something, even without sound. And so they gave their ideas a shape. They gave them stone. This video is about what Roman sculpture said, without words. It is not a list of facts or a timeline of emperors. It is a quiet exploration of how form, posture, material, and gesture became a visual language. A language that told people who was in charge. What kind of life was honorable? Who had been remembered? And who was worth remembering? An emperor's statue might stand tall, eyes fixed beyond the horizon, hand raised in quiet command. It did not shout. It did not move. But it spoke. I am the ruler. I am the state. I am the present and the future. A funerary bust of a wife, draped in modest robes, might say something gentler. She was loyal. She was wise. She stood quietly, but firmly. A small altar carving might show two freed slaves side by side, stiff and simple in form, yet radiant with silent pride. We lived. We earned this. We belong. Each of these figures and countless others told a story, not in speech, but in presence. To the Romans, this was not just art. It was visibility. It was memory. It was the way identity could be held, shaped, and extended through time. Statues filled the spaces of Roman life the way writing fills ours. They were placed carefully and looked upon often. They created a rhythm of meaning across cities and homes, temples and tombs. Some were small, some were massive, some lifelike, some idealized, but all of them said something. In this video, we will move slowly through that silent world. We will explore three kinds of sculptural language. The language of power, used by emperors and officials to shape public identity. The language of virtue, found in stoic faces and modest postures, reflecting Roman ideals. And the language of memory, carved into funerary reliefs and ancestral busts, preserving presence across generations. This is not a story you need to memorize. You don't need to know names or dates. You don't even need to stay awake. This is something to listen to gently, to fall asleep to, or to drift through with soft curiosity. Let this be an invitation, not just into Roman sculpture, but into the deeper question it leaves behind. What does it mean to be seen, remembered, and understood? Without ever saying a word, let us begin. Power does not always speak. Sometimes it simply stands. In ancient Rome, power was not just written in laws or declared in speeches. It was shaped in stone. A Roman statue, especially one placed in public, did not need to move or speak to communicate authority. It needed only to exist, to stand, to be seen. Imagine walking through a Roman forum. Around you, columns rise, voices echo, and sunlight catches the edge of carved marble. But one figure draws your attention. A statue, taller than a man, standing still on a plinth. The emperor, draped in armor or wrapped in a toga. His gaze fixed ahead, hand raised in a quiet gesture. He does not look at you, but beyond you, toward a world he already understands. You do not question who he is or what he means. You know, This was the design. The Romans knew that leadership was not just a matter of governing, but appearing. Emperors had to be seen, not only by those who lived in Rome, but by the entire empire, by farmers in Spain, traders in Egypt, soldiers in Gaul. Sculpture made this possible. A statue could go where a ruler could not. It could stand in his place. It could represent his presence, even in absence. The most famous example of this is the statue known as the Augustus of Prima Porta. Carved in white marble, it shows Augustus, Rome's first emperor, standing tall, right arm extended, in a gesture of command. He wears a breastplate detailed with God's victories and symbols of peace, and a draped cloak gathered over one arm. His face is calm, idealized, youthful. His feet are bare, and at his side, almost small enough to miss, stands a tiny figure of Cupid riding a dolphin. Every detail has meaning. His gesture, known as the adlocutio, is a pose used in Roman art to show a leader addressing troops or the people. It projects calm authority, not force, but assurance. The breastplate depicts a key political achievement, the peaceful return of Roman standards from the Parthians, flanked by divine figures that represent order and fertility. The bare feet suggest that Augustus is more than a man. He is being portrayed in a sacred, almost divine register. And Cupid? A quiet reminder that Augustus claimed descent from Venus through her son Aeneas. He is not only emperor, he is part of the myth that founded Rome. This statue does not raise its voice, it does not move, but it speaks. I am chosen, I am strong, I am harmony between man and God. Look and remember who rules you. Other emperors followed this example. Hadrian, the traveler and builder, appears in sculpture with a thoughtful face and a neatly trimmed beard, styled like a Greek philosopher. His busts convey calm intelligence, reflective, stable, dignified. Caracalla, in contrast, is often sculpted with a sharp expression, his brow furrowed, eyes turned to the side. He seems alert, even suspicious, projecting a ruler who is ready to act, to fight, to protect. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, is best known from a bronze equestrian statue. He sits on horseback, his right hand extended, his face serene. He leads not through fear, but presence. These statues differ in tone, but not in purpose. Each one was a visual message, carefully designed to reflect and reinforce the emperor's public image. And these images were not rare. They were multiplied, replicated, and distributed throughout the empire. In temples, in forums, in bathhouses, along roads, Roman subjects saw these figures constantly. And each time, the message was reinforced. This is your emperor. This is order. This is Rome. Sculpture allowed the emperor to be everywhere at once. His likeness stood watch over the law courts, the marketplaces, the places where people gathered, worshipped, and lived. To see him in stone was to be reminded that the empire was stable, that someone was in control. And when a new emperor came to power, new statues were made. Old ones might be altered, names erased, heads replaced. A new face might be set atop an older body. In some cases, the same pose was kept, only the identity changed. The language of power remained the same, only the speaker shifted. In the next section of part 1, we'll explore how colossal statues elevated that message, turning the emperor into something more than mortal. We'll also look at imperial busts, which brought that presence into the private world, homes, offices, shrines. Together, they formed a sculptural vocabulary of control, repeated endlessly, silently across the empire. If the statues of emperors like Augustus were meant to be seen, then the colossal statues were meant to be remembered, not just with admiration, but with awe. Throughout Rome and its provinces, emperors commissioned statues that stood many times larger than life. Their purpose was not subtle. They were built to dominate space, to impress from a distance, to frame entire buildings and cityscapes with the shape of imperial power. One of the most famous stood near the Flavian amphitheatre, what we now call the Colosseum. But that name originally belonged to something else entirely, a statue, the Colossus of Nero. This massive figure, said to have been over 30 meters tall, depicted Nero in the style of a sun god. After Nero's death, the statue was repurposed, its face recarved, its meaning reassigned. Later emperors made it their own, but the scale remained, and so did the message. The emperor was larger than life. He could not be ignored. He was, quite literally, the framework around which the empire turned. We can only imagine what it felt like to stand beneath such a statue, its face towering above rooftops, its shadow stretching across the stones of the forum. You would not have met the emperor's gaze. You would have felt it descend. And in that downward glance, there was no invitation, only presence. Another example, more fragmented but still imposing, is the Colossus of Constantine. What survives today are pieces: a vast marble head, a hand with outstretched fingers, a foot large enough to stand beside. These fragments, now displayed in the Capitoline museums, are quiet in their ruin, but they still hold power. The face is abstract, stylized, almost emotionless. The eyes are huge, gazing upward, not toward the viewer, but toward the divine. This is no longer the emperor as man. This is the emperor as symbol, as extension of cosmic order. The statue did not ask for attention. It assumed it. And even in pieces, it still speaks. I ruled. I endure. These colossal statues were often installed in basilicas, forums, or temple courtyards. They stood at the end of long colonnades, framed by arches or raised on high pedestals. They were not meant to be approached closely. Their language was distance. Their purpose was to mark space as imperial, but not all power in sculpture was grand in scale. Some of it was small, portable, personal, and in some ways even more enduring. The imperial bust brought the emperor into everyday life. These sculpted heads, sometimes including the upper chest, sometimes just the face, were placed in public buildings, private homes, libraries, and shrines. They stood in corners, on shelves, in recessed niches. They watched over the domestic and the mundane, and they did so with quiet authority. A bust of the emperor was not just a likeness, it was a symbolic presence. To display one was to declare loyalty. To care for one was to acknowledge the structure of the state. And to see one day after day was to absorb the visual rhythm of Roman power. Some busts were heavily idealized. Others showed signs of aging or tension. Vespasian, for example, is often sculpted with a lined face and receding hair, a look that conveys honesty, hard work, realism. Hadrian, in contrast, appears thoughtful, serene, cultured. His beard and hair are carefully carved, his expression inward. Caracalla appears suspicious, sharp-eyed, impatient. Each bust reinforces a mood. Each face tells a silent story. These stories were repeated throughout the empire. A governor might install the emperor's bust in his office. A priest might place one in a temple. A citizen might include it in a family shrine. Sometimes, when a new emperor took power, sculptors would simply replace the head on an existing statue, updating the likeness without remaking the entire form. The body stayed the same, only the speaker changed. This practice says something about Roman sculpture. It wasn't always about individuality. It was about continuity, about function. The image was not the man, it was the role. Even so, the craftsmanship of many busts is extraordinary. The pupils of the eyes are carefully incised. The folds of the toga are rendered in soft, rhythmic curves. Hair is layered, stylized but textured. These aren't just recordings of a face. They are compositions. They are decisions. They decide how power should look, how it should feel, what kind of presence it should have, not in voice or action, but in stone. And this presence worked. A Roman walking through the basilica, attending court, visiting a bathhouse, or dining in a friend's home might see the emperor's face dozens of times, and each time the face said nothing. But it said enough. It said, "I am Rome. I see you." This sculptural repetition was part of a larger strategy of unity. It didn't matter where you lived, in a crowded Roman neighborhood or a remote corner of the empire. You would see the same face. You would recognize the same pose. You would learn without being told who ruled and why. The language of power in Roman sculpture was not loud, but it was persistent. It shaped space. It shaped thought. It gave the empire a face, and that face was everywhere. To understand Roman power in sculpture, it helps to remember that repetition was not redundancy. It was reinforcement. The same posture, the same gaze, the same outstretched arm or distant stare. These were not habits. They were choices, deliberate, designed and calibrated to create the impression of certainty. The Romans used sculpture not just to celebrate power, but to stabilize it. In a world of shifting loyalties, changing borders, and imperial succession, the repetition of familiar forms brought order. The emperor might be new, but the statue was known. The gestures were known. The language was known. And so the empire continued. These statues weren't meant to surprise. They were meant to assure. The viewer didn't need to interpret. They already understood. They recognized the polished forehead of Augustus, the beard of Hadrian, the sharp intensity of Caracalla's brow. Whether you were in Rome or on the edge of the Danube, the emperor's image remained constant. But sculpture didn't only speak through form, it also spoke through material. White marble was prized for its clarity and softness, a stone that could be carved with detail and polish. It caught the light gently, it glowed in sunlight. It reflected moonlight in courtyards. To see a marble statue was to see something still, but never lifeless. Some statues were made of bronze, many of which were lost to time, melted down in later centuries. But bronze had its own language. It shimmered. It was dark and rich in color. It was lighter than marble and could be cast in complex poses. In the flicker of torchlight, a bronze emperor might almost move. A few statues were carved from porphyry, a rare purple-red stone quarried in Egypt. Porphyry was hard to shape, heavy to transport, and visually striking. It became associated with the imperial household, the color of emperors. To see a porphyry statue was to see exclusivity, authority, absolute separation from ordinary life. Regardless of material, placement carried equal meaning. A statue standing in the center of a forum did not carry the same message as one placed in a household niche. The scale might differ, the message might adjust, but the core idea remained. The emperor is here. The state is here. The sculpted body stands in for the body politic. Sometimes these statues appeared beside gods, or in temples, or on coins. This was not about confusion. It was about alignment. By placing the emperor alongside Jupiter, or Apollo, or Mars, the sculpture reinforced a divine association. The emperor might not be a god, but he was close, touched by the same order, part of the same cosmic harmony. In Rome, to be seen was to rule, and sculpture made that possible. But the real power of Roman sculpture was not in its size, its stone, or even its subject. It was in its stillness. Roman statues did not lunge forward. They did not twist or contort in wild motion. They stood, 1 foot forward, one arm lifted, one hand lowered. These poses, rooted in classical Greek forms, created an atmosphere of permanence. Stillness in Roman sculpture meant stability. It meant that power did not need to rush. It was already there. It didn't need to defend itself. It had already been secured, and it didn't need to dazzle. It only needed to remain. This sculptural stillness became a kind of imperial posture, a visual silence that carried more weight than words. To the Roman eye, a statue that moved too much or expressed too much could be suspicious. It was too personal, too unpredictable. But a statue that stood, that endured, that could be trusted, and that trust, that recognition of form and posture, became part of Roman political life. It shaped how people imagined the emperor, how they experienced the state, how they felt themselves within the structure of power. To walk beneath a colossal statue, to see the emperor's bust in a shrine, to pause before a figure carved in marble with calm eyes and raised hand. These were not passive moments. They were acts of perception, of orientation, of social memory. In a world of voices, sculpture remained quiet, but its silence was not absence. It was a statement. In that silence, the emperor watched, the empire watched, and the people saw themselves reflected back, not as individuals, but as part of a whole. The sculpted body of the ruler became a body the viewer could not escape. It occupied the street, the room, the ritual. It was neither aggressive nor intimate. It was simply there, anchored in stone, in repetition, in stillness. And in that stillness, it endured. Even now, in museums and ruins, we still walk beneath those eyes. We still stand before the raised hand, the tilted chin, the ever-calm mouth. The language of power, carved long ago, still speaks. It does not change. It does not fade. It does not forget. It stands. Not all Roman statues were carved to rule. Some were carved to live rightly. In the Empire of Marble, power stood tall and commanding, but beside it, often more quietly, stood a different kind of figure, one that expressed not dominance, but dignity, not command, but composure. These statues were not meant to awe. They were meant to affirm. They reminded viewers not who ruled them, but how they should live. Virtue in Roman life was not abstract. It had shape. It had stance. And the statues that embodied it were shaped not to impress, but to stabilize the world around them, to model character through posture, to make ideals visible. You see this most clearly in sculptures of Roman women, especially the sculpted type known as the Pudicidia figure. The name comes from Pudicidia, a Roman virtue meaning modesty, chastity, and feminine dignity. These statues usually show a woman standing, wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, first a tunic, then a long stola, and finally a palla, draped around the body and pulled over the head like a veil. Her hands are sometimes folded at her waist. Sometimes one hand gathers the cloak, drawing it tighter. Her gaze is downcast. Her stance is balanced, composed. There is no motion, no flourish, only form. This was the Roman ideal. A woman who stood with modesty, quiet confidence, and respect for tradition. She does not declare herself. She does not claim space, but she occupies it fully and without apology. These statues were often funerary, placed in tombs, family altars, or roadside memorials. They honored mothers, daughters, and wives, not for beauty or wit, but for their virtue, that they had kept the home, that they had stood beside their husbands, that they had passed on Roman values to the next generation. Sometimes these women were real, sometimes idealized. Often it was both. The individual faded into the type. The person became part of the form. To the Roman viewer, this was not generic. It was comforting. It showed that even in death, the moral order remained. And it wasn't only women. Roman men too were sculpted to embody virtue, but a different kind. Gravitas, seriousness; constantia, steadiness; disciplina, self-control; and fides, faithfulness. These values were not best shown in action, but in age. While Greek statues had often idealized the body in youth, athletic, perfect, divine, the Romans developed a taste for realism, especially in the Republican period. They prized wrinkles, jowls, furrowed brows. They honored age as a mark of service, of sacrifice, of public life well lived. These veristic portraits, veristic from verus meaning truth, captured the rough textures of a life spent in duty. The nose might be broken, the skin loose, the expression stern, but all of this was intentional. To be seen as aged and worn was to be seen as worthy. These busts were displayed in homes, on family altars, and sometimes paraded in funerals. They didn't hide mortality. They embraced it. The message was, this is what honor looks like. This is what civic life demands. Even among the elite, sculpture was not always about beauty. It was about bearing. In one funerary relief from the 1st century BCE, a man and woman stand side by side. Their clothing is simple, their faces plain. Their bodies are stiff, posed frontally, arms close to their sides. But there is something powerful in that simplicity. They are not trying to be admired. They are simply there, present, witnesses to their own life. The relief says very little, but in that stillness it speaks. It says, we lived honorably, we belonged, we will be remembered. One of the most touching expressions of Roman virtue appears in statues and reliefs of those who were formerly enslaved. After earning or purchasing their freedom, many freedmen and freedwomen chose to be remembered in stone, not with wealth or grandeur, but with respectability. Their monuments were often modest, their figures stiff and frontal, their names proudly carved in Latin. But their statues held a quiet power, the power of belonging. To be sculpted as a Roman citizen, even after a life that began in bondage, was a declaration, a statement that one had entered the moral and civic world, that one had achieved not wealth, but place. On many of these monuments, we see husband and wife standing together, or entire families carved in high relief, shoulders squared, eyes forward, robes neatly arranged. There is no movement, no individual flourish, but this stillness is deliberate. It communicates order, decency, participation in Roman life, and in that participation we find virtue. Because in Rome, to be part of the social and civic fabric, to fulfill one's role as citizen, parent, patron, spouse, was itself a moral ideal. The sculpted body became a kind of anchor, holding a life in place. Even when the details were few, the form did the speaking. A man with a scroll in hand was not just literate, he was trustworthy. A woman holding her cloak or veil was not just clothed, she was honoring tradition. A child standing between parents was not just a son or daughter, but a symbol of family continuity. These were visual expressions of character, not told in stories, but held in pose. And the medium of sculpture reinforced that pose. Stone is still, it is unchanging. Once carved, it does not shift. And in Roman thought, that quality of endurance mirrored the qualities of moral strength: steadiness, patience, self-restraint. To stand still in sculpture was to stand rightly in society. That stillness was itself a form of virtue. We also see this moral language in the way Roman citizens chose to represent themselves in communal settings, especially on tomb altars and family memorials. In these settings, the emphasis wasn't on status, but on contribution. The man who served his city as a clerk, the woman who raised 3 daughters in modest comfort, the couple who lived as freed people and supported a small household. Their sculpted images appear not to elevate, but to record, to place their lives into the larger moral memory of the community. These statues are not heroic, but they are deeply human. They tell us that virtue in Rome was not always dramatic. It could be quiet, private, rooted in patience, in discipline, in simple presence. Even in the faces of emperors and elite officials, sculptors often work to include a moral signal. In busts of Republican statesmen, we see weathered cheeks, thinning lips, focused gazes. These details weren't flattering, but they were intentional. They communicated gravitas, the weight of seriousness and public service. In contrast, overly polished portraits, too smooth, too idealized, could be read as shallow, as disconnected from the hardships and burdens that made a man respectable. To appear too young was to appear untested. To appear too perfect was to seem false. Roman viewers knew this. They read sculpture with trained eyes. They understood what expressions meant, what gestures meant, what stillness meant. It was not the smile or the sparkle of the eye that made a statue virtuous. It was the way it stood, the way it held space, the way it fit into the larger sculptural world around it. Virtue, after all, was not something loudly claimed. It was something carried, and stone could carry it forever. Roman sculpture didn't only reflect virtue, it taught it. In streets, homes, and sacred spaces, statues served as silent reminders of what it meant to be good. Not only great, not only victorious, but good by Roman standards. That meant being patient, composed, loyal. It meant staying within one's role, upholding duty, conforming to an unspoken visual ideal. Children grew up surrounded by these images, not just of gods or emperors, but of everyday people, relatives, patrons, ancestors, neighbors, sculpted with quiet purpose. The statues weren't loud, but they were everywhere, and their repetition created a visual rhythm of morality. You might walk past a tomb on the road into town. You might pass a statue on the way to the bath. You might eat dinner in a room where a bust of your grandmother looked out from a niche in the wall. These weren't private symbols. They were cultural lessons, rendered in stone. They asked nothing of the viewer, but they expected understanding, stillness, modesty, upright posture. These became cues, silent expressions of what was admired, what was expected, and in time, what was remembered. Even when viewers didn't consciously read the details, they absorbed the message. Over time, a certain pose meant trust. A certain expression meant dignity. A certain tilt of the head or calm of the hand came to signify values that words couldn't capture. This is the power of visual language. It doesn't just speak once. It repeats, it surrounds, it sinks in. And for the Romans, this language shaped the texture of moral life. Not through rules, but through form. Some statues reinforce this through pairing and placement. In family tombs, a husband and wife might be shown side by side, their forms nearly identical. Both figures dressed simply, both posed without emotion, and yet, in their symmetry, they said something profound. We lived rightly, We stood together. We leave this life in harmony. Other monuments, especially those of civic benefactors, showed figures seated or standing before altars or holding small tokens, scrolls, scroll cases, sacrificial implements. These objects didn't distract from the stillness. They enhanced it. They framed the figure as morally useful, as someone who gave, who participated, who helped bind the Roman world together. Sometimes the sculpture was placed beside an inscription, but not always. For the literate, the words might add detail, but for everyone else, the statue already said what mattered. It was visible, accessible, unchanging, and that visibility was part of the sculpture's moral function. To stand in stone was to remain a participant in the life of the city, even after death. In this way, sculpture became part of Roman time. It held the past in place, but it also extended into the future. It said, "This was who we were. This is what you should be." Unlike poetry or painting, which asked for attention, sculpture asked only for space. It lived in the background, but its message endured. To the modern eye, Roman statues might seem repetitive. Similar faces, similar robes, similar poses. But this sameness was part of the virtue. Individual flair was less important than social rhythm. The sculpture wasn't meant to celebrate uniqueness. It was meant to reinforce structure. You could look at a statue and know, this is a mother, this is a magistrate, this is a teacher, this is a citizen. Not just in role, but in character. The values weren't shouted, they were held. Today, these statues sit in quiet galleries, their surfaces worn, their names often lost, but their poses still speak. Their forms still hold the virtues they were carved to express. To be remembered as modest, as serious, as faithful, that was enough. To be seen as composed, as present, as reliable, that was the legacy. And in the language of Roman sculpture, that legacy was never loud. It was still. It was enduring. It was virtuous. Some statues did not speak of power or virtue. They spoke of memory. They stood quietly in tombs, lined roads leading into the city, and filled chambers carved beneath the earth. These figures were not carved to command or instruct. They were made to remain. In ancient Rome, to be remembered was not just a hope. It was a duty. For the living and the dead, memory connected generations. It preserved names, faces, and values. And sculpture became one of the most powerful ways to keep memory near. Funerary sculpture in Rome was deeply personal. It was also deeply public. Along major roads outside the city gates, where burial was permitted, you would see tombs rising on either side. Some were large and ornate. Others were small, tucked between structures, simple in design. Many bore images, stone reliefs of couples, families, or individuals standing side by side, gazing outward, timeless and still. They did not smile, they did not move, but they were present. And presence was the point. A typical funerary relief might show a husband and wife standing close, their clothing carefully carved, their arms held near their sides. Their names are sometimes inscribed below, their professions, their status. Sometimes a short phrase, well-deserving, devoted, loyal, a soft eternal echo. But even when the words fade, the stone still speaks. In these portraits, the body is not idealized. It is honest. The man may be balding, his features weathered. The woman may be plain, her hair pinned back simply. Their eyes, carved large and calm, meet ours across time. They ask nothing, but they are still here. This was what mattered. To be sculpted was to be seen. To be seen was to be remembered. And for many Romans, especially freed people who had only recently gained citizenship, this visibility was everything. The ability to commission a tomb, to mark one's place in society, To say I lived, I loved, I belonged was a triumph of memory over obscurity. These tombs were not built to impress the powerful. They were built to hold space in the moral landscape of the city. To say to passers-by, we mattered, we live rightly, remember us. Inside Roman homes, memory lived not just in tombs, but in the atrium, the central open-air room that anchored the house. Here, arranged along wooden shelves or in small niches, families kept busts of their ancestors. These weren't art objects, they were part of life. The Roman elite called them images maiorum, images of the ancestors. They were modelled in wax, then cast or copied in stone, and they served a deeply human function. They held the faces of the dead within the everyday. Each bust was a presence, a grandfather who had served the city, a mother who had upheld the household, a lineage carried forward, not in story alone, but in visible form. These images didn't disappear after funerals. They were kept close, watched over rituals, bore witness to marriages, contracts, and moments of inheritance. When a family member died, the busts of earlier ancestors were sometimes carried in procession, held up on rods, worn with masks, or arranged beside the bier. This was not theatrical. It was ritual memory, a way of saying, you join them now. We carry you with us. In this sculptural tradition, memory became generational, not just an individual's legacy, but a chain, a sequence of virtues and choices fixed in place through form. The faces themselves weren't always flattering. Some were stern, some were aged, some featured irregularities like broken noses or asymmetrical eyes. But these details were part of the truth. To alter them too much was to sever the link. The bust had to feel like the person it recalled. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be present. Even in more modest homes, where full busts were too costly, small statuettes or wall reliefs played a similar role. Some were placed in lararia, household shrines that included gods, ancestors, and symbols of protection. There, beside the images of the lares and penates, the ancestral figure stood, joining the sacred cycle of daily life. Food offerings were made, lamps were lit, a drop of wine, a whispered name, and the sculpture, as always, remained. This constant presence was not about grief, it was about continuity. The Romans believed that death did not erase you, it relocated you. And sculpture helped mark that relocation. It placed the departed where they could still see, still watch, still remind. And so statues appeared in places of decision, in atriums, in dining rooms, in entrance halls. They created a sense of proximity, even after the voice had gone. They filled the silence with something more permanent than sound, form. That form didn't need to be dramatic. It didn't need to show action or emotion. It just needed to be there, solid, upright, familiar. In time, the viewer forgot the carving, forgot the chisel marks. What remained was the person, or something close to them. Stone does that. It holds presence without urgency. It allows memory to settle, not as a sharp edge, but as a rhythm, a repetition, a quiet return. You saw them in the morning light. You passed them as you went about your work. You paused, perhaps, at the end of the day, and they were there. Some Roman sculptures of memory were large, placed in family tombs, or built into the facades of city walls. Others were humble, small plaques, carved reliefs, simple busts. But all of them performed the same task. They said, "Do not forget, even when we, the viewers, do not know the names, even when the inscriptions are broken or missing, we still sense the intention. The form remains. A hand holding a scroll, a face looking calmly forward, a figure standing beside a spouse or child. These statues did not ask to be admired. They asked only to be seen, to be included in the world of the living, even after that life had ended. Sometimes memory was shared. Tombs might include multiple generations, 3, 4, even 5 names carved into a single panel. Statues might show a family group, father, mother, children, perhaps even a freedman or servant. The arrangement was not decorative, it was genealogical. It told a story of continuity. It marked a presence across time. You see this especially in the tombs of freed people. In these carvings, we often find scenes of daily life. A husband and wife sitting together, a father and son, a woman holding a stylus, suggesting literacy. These scenes weren't just personal, they were aspirational. They said, we earned our place. We entered memory through dignity. In some cases, memory was expressed through reuse. A statue made for one person might later be altered for another, head replaced, inscription changed. Sometimes this was practical. Stone was expensive. Sometimes it was political. Old names erased, new ones inserted. But the sculpture itself remained. Even in these altered forms, there is something haunting. A statue that has held more than one name. A body that has stood through more than one life. The layers of memory build quietly in the surface of the stone. There is, in Roman sculpture, a recognition that memory is imperfect, that names fade, that lives, even when honored, grow distant. But still, something endures. The gaze, the gesture, the form. These sculptural forms do not move. They do not reach out. They do not explain themselves, but they allow us to linger, to look, to wonder. In that moment of stillness, where the viewer pauses before the carved figure, something happens, a kind of quiet empathy, a recognition that someone stood here once, that someone was held in love, that someone wished not to disappear. And so they asked stone to remember, and stone in its own way did. Even today, Roman funerary sculpture continues to speak, not in sentences, not in facts, but in presence. We see a bust worn by time, a figure with its nose broken, a hand resting on the edge of a robe. And we understand, someone stood for this person. Someone gave them a place. That place may now be in a museum, or along a garden path, or in a buried chamber half lit by morning light. But the intention is still there, to be seen, to be held, to be recalled, even if only for a moment. Roman memory was not loud, it did not demand, but it was steady. In sculpture, memory found its shape, not as a monument to greatness, but as a practice of care, of looking, of saying silently, "You are still here." Some statues were not meant to be looked at. They were meant to be approached. In the temples of ancient Rome, cool spaces of shadow and incense, stood figures unlike any other, larger than life, distant, still. These were not portraits or monuments. They were presences, representations of gods and goddesses, forms meant not only to remind, but to contain. To the Romans, sculpture could do more than commemorate. It could invite, it could hold space for the sacred, and it could allow the divine to be seen, without voice, without motion, and without explanation. Inside the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Rome's most important shrine, stood a statue of Jupiter enthroned, modeled after the great Greek Zeus at Olympia. He was carved to radiate order, one hand holding a staff, the other raised or extended, with eagles or thunderbolts beneath his feet. His beard was stylized, his gaze remote. He was not a god who walked among men. He watched from above. Other deities appeared in temples across the empire. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war, stood helmeted and armed, but calm. Mars, god of war, was often shown seated, composed rather than violent. Venus, the goddess of beauty and love, stood in gentle contrapposto, one hand covering her breast, the other at her thigh, at once modest and eternal. These figures weren't ornamental, they were focal. The rituals performed around them, offerings, prayers, festivals, were not addressed only to ideas, but to the forms themselves. It was believed that during certain rites, the god might even inhabit the statue, not permanently, but momentarily, a descent into form, a meeting between worlds. This belief gave sculpture a special kind of silence, not empty, charged. The temples were arranged to support this. Often, the statue was placed in a cellar, a chamber behind columns, framed in darkness. The figure emerged slowly as the viewer stepped forward. Light might catch the gold leaf or polished stone. Candles flickered at its base. Smoke from incense curled around its feet. You did not speak to such a statue. You waited for it to speak to you. In some cases, statues were carried in processions. Draped, veiled, or mounted on platforms, they were paraded through city streets. The god moved among the people, not as wind or flame, but in carved form. People threw flowers, sang hymns, made signs of reverence. The statue did not move, but it moved through the world, and in that passage, it became something more than art. It became a vessel. This sculptural divine language wasn't limited to temples. It extended into homes. Most Roman houses included a lararium, a small domestic shrine, often built into a wall or niche near the kitchen or atrium. Here, families placed small statues or figurines representing the lares and penates, guardian spirits of the household and pantry, as well as Genius, the spirit of the household's patriarch. These figures were rarely more than a foot tall. Some were made of bronze, others of terracotta or stone. Their forms were simple: dancing men in tunics, small altars, flame symbols, protective animals. But their role was deep. They were addressed daily. Food was placed before them. Wine was poured. Their presence sanctified the space. Even without grandeur, they spoke. They said, "This place is watched over. This life is blessed. This family is not alone." In these lararia, divine sculpture was not remote. It was domestic, intimate. It stood not above, but among. A sacred rhythm woven into daily life. Elsewhere in the empire, gods were sculpted not just according to Roman ideals, but through fusion. In Egypt, North Africa, Gaul, and the eastern provinces, local deities were sometimes merged with Roman ones, creating hybrid forms. One of the most striking is Serapis, a god introduced under the Ptolemies but embraced by the Romans. Serapis combined Greek and Egyptian elements. A strong, bearded male figure seated on a throne, with heavy robes, a serene expression, and a modius, or grain basket, atop his head. He represented fertility, abundance, and resurrection. His statues were carved in marble or cast in bronze. He appeared both near and far, divine, but human-shaped. Another was Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood and magic. Adopted by Roman religion, she was often shown in statues as youthful and composed, her head crowned with lunar or horned headdresses. Her form evoked both mystery and protection. These sculptures did not erase local belief. They gave it shape. And in doing so, they expanded the divine visual language of the Roman world. The sacred became something you could approach, name, and stand before. And so, too, did the emperor. By the late 1st century CE, it became common to deify certain emperors after their death. Sculptures of them began to take on divine features: radiant crowns, flowing robes, barefoot stances. Sometimes they appeared among the gods, seated beside Jupiter, standing with Mars or Apollo. Other times, their busts were placed in temples or lararia alongside divine figures. This didn't always mean they were worshipped as gods in the modern sense, but they were treated as intermediaries, bridges between mortal and sacred. Their sculpted images reinforced that status, and in these forms, we see the blending of all three sculptural languages: power, virtue, and memory. Elevated into divinity, the emperor's gesture becomes the god's. The ancestor's bust stands beside lares and flames. The household shrine echoes the temple niche. The divine enters the human world, not with thunder, but with stillness. Even in their silence, these sculptures created connection between worshipper and God, between the state and the sacred, between the seen and the unseen. And perhaps that's what Roman divine sculpture said best: the sacred is near, the sacred is here. Look and remember, these statues asked nothing but space, a ledge, a chamber, a clearing on the festival road, and in return, they gave presence, a carved form to hold reverence, a visible stillness in which prayer could settle. Today, many of these figures are broken, their arms gone, their symbols faded, the gilding lost, but their forms remain, and their atmosphere remains with them. A god on a throne, a goddess with outstretched hand, a family's protector beside the hearth. They are still, but they are not empty. They carry the divine, not in sound, but in space, not in action, but in form. And when we stand before them, we do what the Romans once did. We see, we wonder, we wait. Not every Roman statue stood to rule. Not every figure reminded or warned or watched. Some were simply beautiful. And beauty, in ancient Rome, was more than pleasure. It was meaning. It was structure. It was a way of drawing the world closer to perfection. To look at a Roman statue and feel calm or longing or awe, that was part of the design. These figures didn't strive. They didn't reach for the heavens. They didn't bend with the weight of virtue or empire. They stood in balance, in rhythm. Their beauty was stillness, shaped into form. Some of the most famous examples are not rulers or gods, but youths. Marble bodies of ideal proportion, curved hips, straight spines, strong necks, arms held at ease, a twist at the waist, or the soft curve of a thigh. These bodies were composed, not posed. They didn't seduce. They didn't demand. But they held your gaze. Perhaps the most iconic is Antinous, the favorite of Emperor Hadrian. Antinous died young, by drowning, perhaps by accident, perhaps by choice. But after his death, Hadrian mourned him with statues, hundreds of them, carved across the empire, in every variation of Greek and Roman style. He appears as a god, as Dionysus, Apollo, Hermes. He is always youthful, always ideal. His hair falls in thick curls. His expression is pensive, soft, eternal. The face is symmetrical, the lips just parted. The body, balanced, passive, perfect. His beauty is not earthly, it is suspended. In Antinous, we see beauty used not to conquer, but to preserve. The emperor could not bring him back, but he could hold his form forever. And so, Antinous became more than a person. He became a presence. Even now, his statues are difficult to pass by. They do not call out, but they pull you in. You don't study them, you dwell with them. This is the Roman way. Roman sculptors inherited much from the Greeks, especially in the search for ideal proportions, the perfect harmony between head, shoulder, hip, leg, the balance between curve and weight. But the Romans added something of their own. They added intimacy. The Greek kouros stands strong and symmetrical, but remote. The Roman youth stands soft, introspective. The Greek god radiates power. The Roman god leans closer, rests a hand on a column, turns slightly inward. In Roman beauty, there is room for feeling, and nowhere is that more evident than in sculptures of Venus. She appears in many forms: Venus genitrix, Venus felix, Venus Anadyomene, sometimes modest, one arm crossing the chest, one hand at the hip, sometimes nude, standing in contrapposto, turning slightly as though just seen. The folds of her robe slip down, her hair is gathered, her gaze is lowered or turned aside, and in her stillness there is more than allure. There is serenity. She is not reaching for love. She is the presence of it. The Romans did not worship beauty, but they understood it. They saw it as a reflection of divine order, of balance, of the body at rest, in the fullness of youth or poise. They did not need beauty to speak. They needed it to remain. Statues of athletes, gods, children, lovers, even sleep itself. Each was shaped not for realism, but for calm, not for narrative, but for atmosphere. These statues lived in gardens, along fountains, in villa courtyards. They were not made to be read. They were made to be felt. In a shaded colonnade, a marble boy leans against a tree trunk. In a private atrium, a reclining river god rests among ivy. In a corner of a bedroom, a bronze statuette of a sleeping figure, eyes closed, limbs gathered, glows in lamplight. None of them move, but none of them are cold. Their beauty is not decoration. It is invitation, a way to sit with form, to let the mind wander, to remember that life, even in its silence, can be lovely. Roman beauty was not loud. It did not require gold or grandeur. It asked only for time. Time to soften the gaze, time to breathe, time to feel that something still and shapely and whole could live beyond the hour. And perhaps that is why these statues endure. They do not rush, they do not age, they remain. Even broken, even worn, even faceless, they hold something whole. A curve, a rhythm, a moment without need. And in their silence, they say what all beauty says, softly. You do not need to hurry. You are already enough. You are here. Roman sculpture does not move. It stands, it sits, it gazes, it rests. In a world of ambition and empire, conquest and ceremony, Roman statues remain still. And in that stillness, they said everything. This was not an accident of style. It was a philosophy. A decision made not just by sculptors, but by the society that shaped them. The Romans believed that movement passed, but form could remain. That motion thrilled for a moment, but stillness could hold a lifetime. To be still was not to be silent. It was to be present. You see it in the emperor's outstretched arm, frozen not in action, but in command. In the matron's folded hands, gathered not in tension, but in composure. In the youth leaning on a tree trunk, eyes lowered, body quiet, beautiful not because he moves, but because he does not need to. Stillness in sculpture creates a kind of time. It slows the world. It extends the moment. It allows the viewer to breathe, to dwell, to notice. A sculpted figure doesn't walk past you. It waits. It lets you circle, pause, return. It is always in place, even when everything else has changed. And in that unchanging form, there is comfort. In Roman life, so full of change, loss, ambition, and death, sculpture became a counterweight. The figures did not age. They did not fade. They did not rise and fall with fortunes. They stayed where they were placed. And in staying, they offered something rare. A space where nothing needed to happen. A space where meaning could settle, not in words, but in form. This is the language of stillness. It doesn't tell stories. It holds them. A woman carved into a funerary relief stands with her husband. Neither speaks, neither turns, but they are present. And in that presence, they carry their life quietly, continuously, forever. A god sits on a throne. His robe hangs in perfect folds. His eyes do not blink, but his calm fills the chamber. He is not there to dazzle. He is there to anchor. A bust rests in a household shrine. The face is unsmiling, the gaze steady. Children grow up beneath that gaze. Generations pass, but the bust does not change. It is a memory made stable, a person held in form, immune to forgetting. Stillness also makes space. It does not compete for attention. It does not demand noise. Instead, it invites the viewer to meet it halfway. You look, you wait, you begin to listen, not with your ears but with your body. The folds of a garment suggest a breath once taken. The curve of a hand suggests a touch no longer felt. The absence of motion becomes a presence of thought. Stillness allows sculpture to be something other than a moment. It becomes a place where the past remains visible, a place where the sacred remains tangible, a place where the self can soften, reflect, and feel. Roman sculptors could have chosen motion. They knew how to depict it, but they chose instead to refine posture, to clarify form, to trust that presence, not action, would speak more clearly. Even dramatic figures, gods in combat, athletes in repose, are rendered not in climax, but in pause. They are not caught in motion, but held just before or just after it. This is the breath of sculpture, the pause between what was and what could be. And in that breath, there is room for meaning, for memory, for you. Even when statues were broken, the stillness survived. A hand without fingers still gestures. A face without eyes still gazes. A body without arms still stands with poise. The form may be incomplete, but the stillness is whole. It's what allows Roman sculpture to remain legible across time. When language fades, when myths are forgotten, when politics are erased, the form still stands. The figure still holds its pose. And in that pose, we see a person, a people, a way of being. Stillness becomes the bridge between then and now, between life and memory, between image and presence. And perhaps this is why these statues continue to move us, even when they do not move, because in their calm, we remember something essential, that life is not always in the gesture, that presence is not always loud, that beauty, power, and memory need not rush to speak. They can wait, they can hold, they can remain, like the stone from which they were made. To look at a Roman statue is to look into time, not as a flow, but as a moment held still, not as a story, but as a form. That form says nothing, and in saying nothing, it says everything. Now that we've walked slowly through these sculpted forms, through emperors and ancestors, gods and guardians, lovers and lines of marble, we return to the beginning, to the question that started it all. What can a statue say if it has no voice? It turns out everything, not in sound, not in speech, but in form, in placement, in silence, in stillness. Roman sculpture gave the empire a language that didn't need words. It shaped power into posture. It turned virtue into calm presence. It carved memory into stone, where names could fade but forms would remain. It made gods visible, not through thunder, but through the gentle weight of presence. It held up beauty, not as decoration, but as rhythm, balance, breath. And it practiced stillness not as absence, but as a way to hold meaning in time. Each of these languages said something different, but together they said something lasting. They said, this mattered, this person, this moment, this value, this presence. And in the world of ancient Rome, to matter was not only to live, but to be seen, to endure, to stand. The emperor's hand, raised, calm, outstretched. The wife's robe, folded gently across her chest. The child beside a tomb, carved small but present. The god in the temple, eyes open, throne eternal. The lover, youthful, ideal, quietly perfect. The ancestor, bust resting above the hearth, watching still. None of these figures move, but they remain. And in that act of remaining, they continue to speak. Roman sculpture reminds us that language doesn't always live in the mouth, that presence doesn't always require sound, that love, power, memory, and belief can live quietly, long after the voice has gone. The figures you've just spent time with were made not to shout, but to stay, not to dazzle, but to dwell, not to explain, but to be there. And perhaps that's what we're seeking too, when we stand before a statue, when we pause in a museum hallway, when we trace the curve of a drapery or the edge of a cheek with our eyes. We're not looking for answers, we're looking for stillness, for something that will hold the moment, for something that says, you're not alone. Others have stood here too, and in that space, in that quiet, we begin to listen. The stone does not speak, but it still says, you are here. I am here. We remain.